The last tablets of Ugarit. The year is 1185 BCE. You are a scribe in the wealthiest port city on the Mediterranean coast. A messenger has just collapsed through your door. He has ridden for 3 days. His letter is shaking in your hands, and what it says is very simple. The ships are coming. The cities are already burning. You press the words into wet clay. You fire the tablet, and then the city burns anyway. French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer began excavating the ruins of Ugarit in modern Syria in 1929. Buried beneath the ash of the destruction layer, his team eventually found something extraordinary, a cache of unbaked clay tablets that had survived only because the fire that killed the city accidentally baked them into permanent ceramic record. Tablet RS 20.238, known among scholars as the oven letter, was found still inside a kiln, mid-process, the moment of writing frozen by the moment of annihilation. The letter from the king of Al-Ashaya, ancient Cyprus, warned Ugarit's king that enemy ships had been spotted at sea and that coastal cities were already falling. A second letter from the Hittite viceroy at Carchemish warned that Ugarit's army had been deployed too far away and that grain and reinforcements were urgently needed. Both letters arrived. Both were read. Archaeologist Marguerite Jan, who directed excavations at the site from 1978 to 2004, documented bronze arrowheads still embedded in the collapsed walls of the destruction layer. The city was never rebuilt. Ugarit vanished from history in a single night, one of the cleanest civilizational endings in the archaeological record. The standard explanation is that the Bronze Age collapse was a systemic catastrophe, simultaneous drought, trade network failure, and the mass migrations of the sea peoples, and that no single city could have escaped a failure that large regardless of any warning. But these tablets are not describing slow economic decline. They are describing specific ships, specific positions, specific military dispositions, written by literate kings to literate kings with days to spare. The question is not whether the warning was sent. It was. Some researchers ask whether the political economy of the late Bronze Age created a collective action trap. Everyone was too economically interdependent to appear weak by evacuating, so nobody moved. Whether that is the answer or not, Ugarit burned. And the last thing its scribes ever wrote was a description of exactly how. From the burning coast of Syria, we move west across the Aegean, to a palace where the last administrative act of a dying kingdom was a military deployment order. The Mycenaean Pylos tablets. In 1939, American archaeologist Carl Blagan walked onto a hilltop in the southwestern Peloponnese and began to dig. On the very first day of excavation, he uncovered over 600 clay tablets. They were administrative records, inventory lists, ration accounts, military rosters, the bureaucratic heartbeat of the palace of Nestor at Pylos. They had survived because the palace's destruction fire, somewhere around 1180 BCE, had accidentally baked them into ceramic permanence. What those tablets record, taken together, is the portrait of a kingdom that saw the end coming and mobilized anyway. Tablet PY and 610, studied exhaustively by Linear B pioneer Michael Ventris and classicist John Chadwick, records the emergency deployment of coastal watchers to specific positions along the Pylos shoreline. A separate group of tablets records bronze being stripped from temple tripods, sacred objects, and recast as weapons. You do not melt your temple furniture for spearheads unless you have run out of options. Linear B scholar Cynthia Shelmerdine of the University of Texas has described the final Pylos archive as the record of a palace system in acute crisis. And yet the crisis was not survived. The palace burned in a single catastrophic fire event, and Mycenaean palace civilization, including the Linear B writing system itself, disappeared from Greece entirely. Writing would not return to the Greek world for roughly 400 years. The mainstream view holds that the palace mobilization may have been a response to a specific raid rather than proof of foreknowledge of total collapse. But the bronze stripping from temples is not a precautionary measure. Someone inside that palace had already decided the gods could wait. They were right about the danger. They were simply out of time. From a palace that read its warning in administrative clay, we travel south across the Aegean to an island civilization that received its warning written in volcanic ash and kept building anyway. The Minoan Thera Ash Warning. Before the island of Thera exploded with the force equivalent to 40,000 Hiroshima bombs, it sent a preview. The preview was pumice, white, weightless, unmistakably volcanic, raining down onto the streets of the most sophisticated civilization in the Bronze Age Aegean. According to geological analysis of the Thera eruption sequence, the catastrophic caldera collapse was preceded by a measurable preliminary eruption that deposited a distinct pumice layer across the region. That layer is physically present. It is datable. It is real. And when Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos began excavating the buried Bronze Age town of Akrotiri on Thera in 1967, he found something remarkable: no bodies. In more than 50 years of excavation across a remarkably well-preserved city sealed under volcanic ash, no human remains have been found. The population of Akrotiri evacuated. The preliminary eruption gave them enough warning to leave. Meanwhile, Greenland ice core dating, led by researcher Sturt Manning of Cornell University, places the catastrophic Thera eruption at approximately 1642 BCE. The Minoan Palace civilization on Crete, 110 kilometers to the south, received the same ash fallout, the same pumice deposits, the same atmospheric signals, and they continued. Palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malaya kept operating for roughly 150 years after the eruption before finally collapsing around 1450 BCE, likely under pressure from Mycenaean invaders who moved into a structurally weakened civilization. Historians argue that 150 years is not denial. It is a civilization absorbing a disaster and adapting. But the pumice swept off Minoan streets every season for a generation tells a different story. Akrotiri's residents proved evacuation was possible. Some researchers ask whether the Minoan palace economy, locked into fixed sea trade routes, fixed storage systems, fixed agricultural infrastructure, was simply too structurally rigid to reorganize around a new reality, even when the ash kept falling. From a civilization that swept volcanic pumice off its streets, we move north and west to the most famous buried city in the world, and the earthquake it was given 17 years to learn from. Pompeii's forgotten earthquake. 17 years before Vesuvius buried Pompeii, the mountain sent a rehearsal. On the 5th of February, 62 CE, a major earthquake, estimated between magnitude 5.0 and 6.0 by modern volcanologists, struck the Bay of Naples directly. It cracked temples, collapsed aqueducts, and killed thousands across the Campanian region. The Roman philosopher Seneca documented it within months in his Naturales Questiones, describing it as the most severe seismic event in living memory for the area. The city of Pompeii looked at the rubble, calculated the cost of reconstruction, and started building. Bigger, more lavishly. The archaeological record at Pompeii shows that the decades between 62 and 79 CE produced some of the most elaborate wall paintings, most luxurious domestic renovations, and highest population densities in the city's entire history. The Temple of Isis, completely destroyed in the earthquake, was fully rebuilt with an inscription recording the reconstruction paid for by a freed slave on behalf of his 6-year-old son as a bid for political status. It was still being renovated when the eruption hit. Pliny the Younger, in his famous letters to the historian Tacitus, describes his uncle Pliny the Elder, noting continuous minor tremors in the days immediately before the August 79 CE eruption. Tremors, Pliny writes, so common that the local population had stopped reacting to them. Volcanologist Haraldur Sigurdsson has noted that the 62 CE seismic event is entirely consistent with subsurface magma movement preceding the eventual eruption. The mainstream view is that the Romans had no volcanology and no framework to connect ground shaking to an inactive-seeming mountain. That is fair, but Pliny the Elder, author of a 37-volume natural encyclopedia, sailed toward the eruption to observe it scientifically. The Romans had curiosity. They had documentation. The population of modern Naples is 3 million. Vesuvius is still active. Some things, apparently, do not change. From the Bay of Naples, we cross the Mediterranean to the ancient Fertile Crescent, where the end of the world's first empire was foretold in cuneiform, sung in temples, and ignored for a century. The Akkadian Drought Oracle. The year is approximately 2200 BCE. You are standing in the granary of the world's first empire. The Akkadians, founded by Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BCE, controlled territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. And then the rain stops, not for a season. According to at least 6 independent geological proxies, sediment cores, pollen records, marine deposits from the Gulf of Oman, including speleothem records published by Flightman and colleagues in the Geophysical Research Letters in 2003, a catastrophic aridification event struck the entire Middle East around 2200 BCE and lasted approximately 300 years. Yale archaeologist Harvey Weiss published the landmark correlation between this event and the abrupt abandonment of the Akkadian provincial capital at Tel Leilan in a 1993 paper in Science, establishing for the first time that abrupt climate change could end a civilization. The Akkadian Empire collapsed around 2154 BCE, roughly at peak drought onset after approximately 180 years of existence. But the remarkable element is the literary record. The Akkadian text known as the Curse of a God, cataloged in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, describes the gods abandoning the city, the irrigation fields yielding no grain, the orchards yielding no fruit. Cuneiform administrative records analyzed by Harvard's Peter Steinkeller show grain ration distributions declining steeply in the empire's final decades. And the civilizations that came afterward built a wall, the so-called repeller of the Amorites, specifically to hold back the climate refugees streaming south from the abandoned north. They knew what had happened. They watched the migrations. And within 2 centuries, their successors were farming the same river valleys, making the same rainfall beds. Some researchers ask whether the Curse of Agade preserves a real environmental memory deliberately encoded as divine punishment. The ancient world's way of warning future kings that there are forces an empire cannot conquer. From a collapse foretold in cuneiform and ignored in limestone, we cross the Atlantic to a jungle city where the warning was written not in text, but in the bones of the people themselves. The Copan Stelae. In the year 800 CE, the king of Copan commissioned a new stone monument. His scribes carved his victories. His laborers hauled a 4-meter stela into the central plaza. And across the valley, in the middens and burial grounds of his subjects, the bones were already telling a story the king refused to read. Strontium and carbon isotope analysis of skeletal remains from Copan published by Rebecca Story in Latin American Antiquity in 1992, documents statistically significant rates of parodic hyperostosis, a bone condition indicating childhood anemia and nutritional deficiency beginning as early as 700 CE. That is approximately 100 years before the last dated monument at the site. Meanwhile, population modeling by Penn State archaeologist David Webster estimates Copan's valley population reached roughly 27,000 people by 800 CE, approximately 10 times the valley's sustainable agricultural capacity under classic Maya farming methods. Paleoclimate data from Belizean stalagmites, published by Douglas Kennett and colleagues in Science in 2012, confirms a series of severe multi-year droughts striking the Yucatan region between 810 and 910 CE. The final dated monument at Copan is Stela 11, carved in 822 CE. Altar Q, completed around 776 CE, depicts all 16 kings of the Copan dynasty in what scholars read as an explicit assertion of dynastic legitimacy during a period of visible social stress. A monument that functions in retrospect less like a celebration and more like a political desperate bid. The mainstream view holds that kings had no alternative. Monumental construction was the only tool available for maintaining social cohesion, and stopping it might have accelerated the very collapse it was meant to prevent. But the bones don't negotiate with political necessity. When children show skeletal signs of famine, the food system is already failing. Some researchers ask whether the monuments weren't denial, but something darker. A performance of permanence staged precisely because everyone at the top already knew it was ending. From the jungle valleys of Central America, we travel to the most isolated island on Earth, where the warning wasn't written in bone or stone, but preserved at the bottom of a volcanic lake. The Easter Island Pollen Line. At the bottom of the Rano Raraku crater lake on Rapa Nui, there is a line in the sediment. Above the line, no tree pollen. Below it, a dense subtropical palm forest, a species similar to the Chilean wine palm that once covered the entire island. The line is the exact moment the island crossed the ecological point of no return. According to sediment core analysis published by palynologist John Flenley, the island was essentially 100% forested at the time of first Polynesian settlement. Radiocarbon dating by anthropologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, published in Science in 2006, places that first settlement at approximately 1200 CE, meaning the entire deforestation sequence, from complete forest to virtually no trees, happened within roughly 400 years. The moai were carved and transported throughout that entire period. The largest moai ever carved, known as El Gigante, stands 21.6 meters tall and weighs an estimated 160 tons. It was never moved. Some researchers suggest the island ran out of trees before it could be transported. Hunt and Lipo's work also identifies a secondary driver. Rats that stowed away on colonist canoes consumed palm seeds at rates that made forest regeneration biologically impossible, a collapse mechanism the islanders had no framework to see coming. When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on the 5th of April, 1722, he found no trees taller than 3 meters and a population estimated at 2,000 to 3,000, a fraction of the 15,000 the island may have supported at its peak. The mainstream view, heavily debated since Jared Diamond's collapse in 2005, is that deforestation was driven by a combination of human cutting and rat predation. But whether by axe or by rat, the pollen line moved towards zero for 4 centuries. Some researchers ask whether the moai weren't an act of denial, but of desperation. Monuments built to petition gods who might restore what was disappearing, season by season, in plain sight. From an island that watched its forest vanish one tree at a time, we travel to the largest pre-industrial city on Earth, where an empire built the most sophisticated water management system in history and engineered itself into a trap it could not escape: Angkor's hydraulic collapse. Imagine engineering a water network so precise that the canals are graded at tolerances of 1 centimeter per kilometer, spanning over 1,000 kilometers of channels and reservoirs across a jungle the size of modern Los Angeles. Then imagine that this same precision is what kills you. LiDAR aerial survey data published by Damien Evans of the French School of the Far East in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2015 revealed the true scale of Angkor's hydraulic infrastructure for the first time, a network the ground-level surveys of 2 centuries had missed entirely. The Westbury Reservoir alone measures 8 kilometers by 2.1 kilometers, engineered to hold tens of millions of cubic meters of water to sustain a population that Roland Fletcher's Greater Angkor project estimates at between 750,000 and 1 million people at its 12th century peak, the largest urban concentration in the pre-Columbian world. Climate proxy data compiled by Brendan Buckley at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, published in PNAS in 2010, documents alternating severe droughts and extreme monsoon flood years across Southeast Asia between 1330 and 1430 CE. Conditions that would have caused the Angkor system, designed for average rainfall, to alternately silt and overflow. Christophe Potier's excavation of the canal network reveals multiple phases of emergency repair in the 13th and 14th centuries: ad hoc earthen plugs in failing sluices, reactive patchwork rather than planned redesign. The mainstream explanation attributes Angkor's fall primarily to the Siamese sack of 1431 CE. But settlement pattern data shows population declining for a century before the attack. Some researchers ask whether the invaders didn't destroy Angkor so much as walk into a city that had already begun to hollow out, a civilization so dependent on precision infrastructure that it could adapt to almost anything except the one thing it was built to ignore: an average that stopped being average. From a hydraulic empire that repaired its failing canals until there was nothing left to repair, we moved to the Indian subcontinent, where the greatest civilizational warning in the ancient world arrived over 200 years, and was answered with more cities. The Indus Valley's disappearing river. Over 60% of all known Harappan cities were built along the banks of a single river system. That figure alone should stop you. Not a coastline. Not a delta. One river. Somewhere between 900 and 1,000 Harappan settlements have been identified along the Ghaggar-Hakra corridor, the ancient channel identified with the Vedic Saraswati, spanning modern Rajasthan, Haryana, and Punjab. Satellite imaging by the Indian Space Research Organization mapped the Paleo Channel at widths of 6 to 8 kilometers in places, consistent with a major prehistoric watercourse that has since dwindled to a seasonal trickle. Sediment analysis by Liviu Giosin of the Woods Hole, Oceanographic Institution, published in PNAS in 2012, established that the river's monsoon-fed component began weakening due to shifting rainfall patterns starting around 2500 BCE, precisely coinciding with the peak of Harappan urban culture. The Harappan civilization at its height covered approximately 1.25 million square kilometers, larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, featuring planned cities with standardized brick dimensions, grid-planned streets, and underground sewage systems that would not be matched in Europe for 3,000 years. Skeletal analysis by Gwen Robbins. Shug of Appalachian State University documents increasing rates of infectious disease and interpersonal violence in late Harappan populations from around 2000 BCE onward. the biological signature of a population under resource stress. The Harappan writing system, with over 400 identified symbols, has never been deciphered. We cannot read whatever their administrators wrote about the water table. That silence is part of the mystery. The mainstream view holds that the so-called collapse was actually a managed dispersal toward the Gangetic Plain, a civilization transforming rather than dying. But 900 cities do not relocate smoothly. Some researchers ask whether the expanding urban construction of the late Harappan period represents not confident growth, but a political choice to concentrate and control a population whose resource base was already quietly disappearing beneath their feet. And then there is the last warning on this list, the smallest, the most intimate, the one that ended not with a volcanic eruption, a drought, or an invading fleet, but with a dietary preference, the Greenland Norse bone record. They survived for 400 years at the edge of the world. They built stone churches. They raised cattle. They traded walrus ivory with the courts of Europe. And then, sometime in the early 1400s, the last Norse Greenlander died, not in battle, not in a plague. The archaeological record of the final occupation layers, analyzed across 4 decades by zoo archaeologist Thomas McGovern of Hunter College, shows cattle stalls containing the bones of animals that had been consumed, including dogs, and no evidence of violent attack or epidemic. The silence of the bone record is the evidence. McGovern's analysis of animal remains from Norse Greenland farm middens reveals that fish bones constitute less than 1% of the faunal record at most eastern settlement sites. Less than 1%. In Iceland and Scandinavia, contemporary Norse sites show fish comprising 50 to 70% of the dietary bone record. The Norse had boats, iron tools, and one of the richest North Atlantic fisheries on Earth surrounding them on every side. Greenland ice core data documents significant cooling beginning around 1300 to 1350 CE, with sea ice extent increasing and the growing season shortening. The onset of the Little Ice Age. Isotope analysis by Niels Linderup of the University of Copenhagen shows a shift towards slightly more marine protein in the very latest Norse Greenland remains, suggesting the population finally began adapting their diet. Too late and too incompletely. The last documentary evidence of a living Norse Greenland community is a church record of a marriage performed at Valsey Church in 1408 CE. After that, silence. The mainstream explanation, developed substantially by McGovern himself, centers on cultural rigidity. A medieval European identity inseparable from cattle farming and Christian practice, psychologically unable to adopt the survival techniques of the Inuit neighbors who lived through the same climate shift. But some researchers push harder. In medieval European social hierarchy, farming was noble, fishing was peasant labor. To fish for survival would have meant publicly admitting that the colonial project had failed. The Norse, it seems, chose to die Norse. Surrounded by cod, they chose the appearance of civilization over the fact of survival. And they chose correctly by their own values. And they starved. 10 civilizations, 10 warnings. Delivered in every form the world knows how to send them. Burning ash on the street, letters pressed into wet clay, a pollen record moving toward zero, a river that spent 200 years quietly disappearing. The mainstream explanation for each collapse is that the people involved couldn't have known. The seismology didn't exist. The volcanology wasn't there. The paleoclimatology was centuries away. And in many cases, that is a fair and honest accounting. But the Pylos scribes were stripping bronze from temples. The Copan kings were watching skeletal famine in their own populations. The Norse were surrounded by fish. The question these 10 cases keep asking across every continent and every era is not whether the warning was legible. In most of these cases, it was. The question is what it takes for a civilization to act on information that threatens the system producing the information. Most people walk past these stories in a textbook and accept the standard account. But you made it here, which means you're asking the harder question. That question is what this channel is for. Hit subscribe and tell me in the comments which of these 10 civilizations had the least excuse for ignoring what it knew. Build the argument, I want to read everyone. The warnings were always there, written in ash, in bone, in the vanishing pollen of a dying forest. The mystery was never whether civilizations received them. They did. The mystery is why we keep being surprised that we are no different.